Robert Sachs has written quite a number of books applying his wisdom and learning about Tibetan Ayurveda and Buddhism and holistic health, and books on meditation, a book on relationships, and his forthcoming book is called The Buddha at War. And he's really going to be sharing with us today about applying the wisdom that he has been taught and that he teaches to the politics and warfare, and teach us and tell us about possible alternative approaches to this. And I know that it's going to be something we find very valuable. So let's bring up Robert Sachs.
Thank you, Brooke. This is kind of, in some ways, breaking new ground for me. I mean, oftentimes the groups that I teach about have to do with, more peaceful aspects of consciousness, about body work, about investigating spirituality from the standpoint of meditative tradition, getting groups together in that way. But at the same time, what I would say is that part of me has always been connected to this topic, and that has to do with generations in my own family that I finally began to acknowledge. Came from a long line of rabbis in Eastern Europe, and in many respects, some of my family that were rabbis had moved from Germany to Romania when it was not possible for Jews to get land in certain parts of Germany. And then at some point, that part of the family emigrated to the United States. And on my mother's side, I had my grandfather, whose grandfather was in Napoleon's army, was injured, moved to Latvia, married a Mongolian Jewess, which made it so that suddenly I've got all these little squat brown people in my family that I wasn't aware of until I saw pictures from many, many generations back. And my grandfather was, during the Bolshevik Revolution, on the side of the Tsar, which was not a particularly smart thing to do at that time, and ended up having to escape, came to the United States. But I would say that both my grandparents, one of my earliest memories in seeing my grandparents together was them arguing, bickering about politics, okay? And my grandfather, in fact, on my father's side, I was mentioning this at the table with everybody when I was sitting there, and we were discussing what you do with your family and things that how you sort out conflict. And my grandfather, in the mid-20s, long before the civil rights era, was doing things like picking up black people at bus stops and saying, just drive with me, rather than you having to sit at the back of the bus, drive along with me side by side and let's just go to wherever you need to go. Never thought anything about it. Obviously caused a lot of stir with the people in the community. My grandfather, who in the mid-20s began to look at what was going on and started talking about there being a crash in the stock market, who in about 1954, I have articles of his that talk about American involvement in Vietnam. In 1954, he wrote these things. So I realized that somehow there is something in my history, or my lineage, so to speak, that somehow connects to that which is going on around it at a social and political level. I didn't really recognize it all that fully. I would say that one of the things that happened to me in the mid-'70s, and it kind of came to me as a surprise because I usually don't really pick up and remember dreams all that well. But in the mid-'70s, I started having dreams where I was spending time with Jimmy Carter. You know, it's like, you think about being with a lover, you think about being with, and I'm with Jimmy Carter. And, and we're having these conversations, and it was very, very strange. And then during the Reagan years, I didn't have any dreams of Reagan. But when Bill Clinton became president, suddenly, several years later, I began to have dreams where I was spending time talking with Bill Clinton. and interactions. And this continued on through his entire presidency, especially when he was going through the real difficult time around, the whole thing that had to do with Monica Lewinsky and how that evolved, so to speak. But then came the election of 2000. And what I would say is that for most of us, I could have dreams like that had gone on for several years, and I could maybe just ponder them a little bit. But nothing jolts you out of complacency and wanting to finally do something unless you have some kind of crisis that emerges. There are wisdom traditions that have existed for thousands and thousands of years on this planet, okay? And they talk about love and compassion and developing all the skills we need to be able to handle our relationships and each other. And most of the time, we don't read them, study them, contemplate them, unless we're backed up against a wall, okay? Unless there's a crisis that's happening. Disaster is our best teacher, okay? So to me, what happened was the election of 2000, okay? Which became something which triggered me to go from just spending time in my dream world to thinking that I needed to do something about what it is that I was picking up on that I had talked about with people for years in relatively, just ongoing conversations, but nothing in a very formal way. And what happened in terms of the election of 2000 was I had a dream in December of 2000 after it had been decided how the appointment was going to go. And I was in a dream with Al Gore and with George W. Bush. And I walked up to Al Gore and I said, "How could you do this? How could you blow the situation?" And he looked perplexed, and he looked like he realized that he had done something that wasn't particularly skillful in how he had handled his campaign. And then I walked up to George W. Bush, who grabbed me by the balls and squeezed. And I looked at him, I went, "I'm not going to come and visit you anymore." And so I haven't. But recently what happened was a dream where I was with John Kerry. And what it was that I was in a building where there were, I was leaving and there were many hats stacked on a shelf. And I went to get my hat and John Kerry thought it was his hat. I said, "No, that's my hat." He said, "No, it's my hat." And I said, "Well, I'm going to take it." And so I took it, and he took me and he pinned me on the ground. And he's looking down on me, and I'm looking up at him, and I'm saying, "You fool, you're going to win in a landslide, get off of me." And he got up and he walked away. And I actually think that that's how it's going to go. I do believe that what it is that what we are seeing, in many ways I ascribe to what Michael Moore talked about in Do Where's My Country, where he talks about the idea that there's actually a much more sort of like liberal or understanding and an appreciation for ambiguity that's a part of the American people that we don't necessarily see in terms of mass media. But there is a lot more intelligence, there is a lot more compassion that is out there, all right? Now, you know basically where I stand on this, but at the same time, I don't want to necessarily give you the idea that this is going to be a Kerry campaign speech or anything like that, okay? Because it's a much more complicated matter than just that. And to some extent, what I want to do is I want to go back to some of the ideas that this country was formed on. And I think it's very interesting that what we have is, in terms of the American experience, a maxim that is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in terms of inalienable rights. Okay, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And what's interesting about that is that founding fathers really discussed this as a maxim, and some of them wanted to have the maxim life, liberty, and property. Okay? And of course, what it is that in the Constitution, there's all sorts of discussions about the rights of people to be able to have property, but what was most important was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay? Because partly what the founding fathers and founding mothers saw about forming a country was that they had come from and were very aware of the history that they had left in Europe and other parts of the world. They saw what happened with elites and power. They saw what happened when property became the most important part of what was going on in people's realities and how people became territorial. They're aware of how corruption can very, very easily get into the dialogue of any situation if property is what is emphasized as being important, that material reality. So what happened was these guys seemed to put together a maxim that in many respects seems kind of airy-fairy. Okay, there's nothing you can really pin down in terms of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it is what informs all of the laws that we have created in this country. And because it is so ambiguous, it creates a dilemma from generation to generation in terms of how that's interpreted. Okay? I think that's the most beautiful aspect of the American Constitution, is you can't pin it down. And almost every generation has judges and legislators that try and figure out what it means. And that is in many ways, a very, very unique document. And what it does is it holds out a promise to people. And people might say, well, gosh, that's a real fantasy, the idea that, America is a land of dreams and a land of promise. And all you have to do is go and spend some time in other countries. And sure, right now a lot of people have certain political attitudes or attitudes about the United States or the United States government, so to speak. But you find out how many people have dreams about America or hold America as a dream that they really aspire to and get excited about, want to hear about where you're from. It's kind of like, America is a land of promise and California is definitely the land of dreams. Okay, I mean, when you tell your people you're from California, it's like, oh, my goodness, it's kind of like you're at the pinnacle of something which is the land of promise. Okay, and I remember a couple incidences which sort of reminded me of that. Some of them are very positive. One was an incident with a Russian couple that had moved to New York. They had lived there for about a year. And one of my friends went to them and said, what has been the most difficult thing you found in coming to America? What has been the most difficult adjustment? And they said, what are you talking about? Considering where we just came from, everything is easy. That was their perception. That there were no problems that they were having. They were basically learning how to live and survive and get on and do what they needed to do in New York. And no matter what you think about New York City or anything like that, it's like for them, it was a cakewalk compared to what they had just come out of. All right? And then looking at, I remember that's the sort of like the positive side of that, and hearing that, it's just very inspiring to hear that from people, And I have a friend who's a Danish Buddhist meditation teacher who would come and run classes and meditation courses, and people would want to talk to them about their problems, their issues, their relationship problems, their boundary problems with other people, et cetera, et cetera. And they'd say, what should we do? And he'd say, just read the International Herald Tribune for a week. He said, people are lining up to have your problems. Okay? So no matter how difficult it seems, and no matter how dark this particular situation in terms of our American climate appears, compared to what's going on in a lot of countries, we have an incredible opportunity and a luxury in how we're making decisions right now. I don't know how long that luxury is going to be, but that's another matter. At the same time, there was, I remember, this was many, many years ago, I was with some Tibetans, and we were, they wanted to make Tibetan tea, and Tibetan tea is the fastest way to develop a high amount of cholesterol in your system. It's black tea, butter, milk, and salt, okay? It's great at high altitudes, okay? What it does is it keeps you warm from the inside. Okay, if you go down to low climates, what it does is it just builds up the fat in your body really fast. Okay, but what happened was we were going to go to a supermarket, and he wanted to get, and he was at the section of the dairy aisle, and we were looking at the fact that he couldn't separate between what was butter and what was margarine. Okay, that was a real hard one. I mean, Tibetan tea with margarine is horrible, you know. But to try to explain to him that the margarine, in terms of the hydrogenated oils, were something that was not good for your body. It was actually kind of toxic. And his attitude was, that can't be. Why would your government allow anything that doesn't help people? You know? Just the idea that, you know, coming to the land of promise, and that there could be something that your government could be doing that would be not in your best interest, so to speak. All right? So this idea of a dream is very, very important to people, and something that they hold on to. And that's something I think we need to remember when we're looking at what we're currently going through in this particular climate that we're in. With respect to the pursuit of happiness, I think one of the things I look at, and this was at a speech that Jimmy Carter gave, I believe it was during the Democratic National Convention, and he talked about that we were looking at America's soul. We were trying to, in fact, recapture America's soul to a more positive or higher ideal. And I think that, to some extent, he was even speaking beyond who gets elected, that somehow the dialogue has got to be lifted up, okay? The conversation that is happening in this country has got to be where, rather than focusing on material success, what's me, what's mine, what's my nation, okay, which in many ways has now been circled by a veil of fear, okay? And fear is so much a part of the American dialogue right now. And to say that what we need to do is get back to the idea of the love and the compassion, the way in which we hold out promise not only to ourselves but to other people, that's got to be there. And to me, what has to happen in this election is that no matter what the outcome, that is the dialogue we need to move back to. That somehow we need to get past this fear base. I have my personal view as to who's going to be more capable of delivering us back to that dialogue. And to me, that's more important. I personally do not believe that there is going to be that dramatic a change in the American climate and the world climate after John Kerry wins the election. But what I do believe is that having a dialogue that is more open and that is more willing to have a sense of intercommunication and a sharing of ideas is more important. In some respects, this is in keeping with Tibetan Buddhist tradition that talks about in the, some of you might have heard the term Kala Chakra. And it was really funny. If you saw the movie Sky Captain that recently came out, he goes into this whole thing about the Kala Chakra astrology and the land of Shambhala, and I'm going, my goodness, who was writing this movie? Okay? But the Kala Chakra is a very advanced form of astrology in Tibetan tradition. And what they say is, and what it goes back to, is a prediction that was made by the historical Buddha about 2,400 years ago, where he said that what would happen at this particular time period is that we would be moving into a dark age, okay? Now, a dark age isn't necessarily like in 1980, this is when a dark age begins. It's not like that. What it is, and what it has to do with, is when the collective confusion, or where our individual confusion begins to be so enmeshed with other people's confusion that it like creates clouds over an atmosphere. So what's actually creating the dark age is us, okay? The dark age is created by us, and that when there is a sufficient amount of confusion that comes from the accumulation of issues that we have not faced lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, whether you believe in reincarnation or not, or whether you're just looking at it from the standpoint of generations that have let things slide from generation to generation, that there's a building up that creates what is a dark age. And in keeping with this, there was a teacher by the name of Namgyal Rinpoche, a very interesting man. He was a Canadian Methodist minister who woke up when he was about 28 years old and suddenly recognized that he understood Sanskrit and Tibetan fluently and didn't know what the hell had happened to him because he hadn't studied those things. And he went to India and he was recognized as a Tibetan reincarnate Lama, and suddenly he had a flash that went back and he was able to suddenly access the information that he had from previous lifetimes, however you want to interpret that. But in about 1979, he talked in a group in London, and he was looking at the idea of a dark age. And he said, you know, there are different ways in which you can look at the age of Aquarius. Okay, he says, because he says we're in the age of Aquarius, but the age of Aquarius has two possibilities. It can be a time when there's love and light and there's a total transformation of society, or what happens is that there is increased a developing of more and more mediocre ways of doing things. There's increased bureaucratization. There's a reduction of personal freedoms that begin to emerge. Okay, and that mostly that is what covers society. But there are pockets of light. Okay, an inside edge, something that people go to. They come together, and what they do is they share ideas and they grow collectively. And that in those pockets of light, there are going to be ways in which people transform themselves very, very quickly. And what they will do is they will be light bearers in dark times. That doesn't necessarily translate into a utopian vision of everything being transformed around us, because according to the Kalachakra Tantra, what's said is that this particular dark age that we're in should last about 300 years. And that it is a battle against fundamentalism. That's what it is. Fundamentalism from the East, fundamentalism from the West. It is the way in which the mind begins to try and limit possibility when there is too much information about things changing too quickly. When things are changing too quickly for most people, people don't necessarily stretch and open up. Most people recoil into something that is more protective, something that is more secure, something that is more well-defined. I think it was very interesting, for example, when we were looking at, and to me it was the issue that most epitomized this in the last political debate, the debate between Kerry and Bush, was on that issue of abortion, which I thought was extraordinary, where Kerry was trying to talk about his own particular view as a Catholic, not supporting abortion, but being pro-choice on the basis of being a president, not wanting to legislate his faith onto other people. And all George Bush could come back with is, you're either for it or against it. That's it. Okay? So what happens is you have a black and white reality versus a reality, because relative reality is extremely ambiguous. Okay? You know, anything is possible in relative reality, the relative we face. We make our reality all the time. There's nothing holding us back. Okay? There are ultimate principles, but then in relative reality, it's all open to interpretation and how we work with it. We sort of like, in some ways, what we do is it's kind of like Sarah McLachlan has an album called "Fumbling to Ecstasy." Okay, I think that's mostly what we do. Okay, we just try and wing it and see what happens. Okay, so you have to understand that what we're looking at is two different ways of looking at this situation. One way is trying to close it off, trying to protect it all, and one way is trying to keep the dialogue open and moving. All right? So that is some of the issues we are facing. And the fact is that is hard work. It is difficult. It is very challenging to be able to face that ambiguity. And when I say to you, by the way, you know, you're hoping that this election is going to turn everything around, and guess what? We got about another 295 years of it. Okay? And you go, oh, why bother? Okay? And what is interesting is that, and I think in many respects, this was an awareness that the founding fathers had, and I think it is an awareness that the Buddhist masters have. It is something that the Iroquois nation, who in many ways inspired the American Constitution, had, the principle of the seventh generation. Understanding that you're taking responsibility, you trying to hold light and consciousness in this particular time period. You may not see necessarily all the fruit of that, but that is extending out further and further and further. And so what you do is you maybe have to conceal your light. Maybe you can't talk to your relatives or your friends about your political views or whatever. But what you do is you share with people where you can. You keep a positive attitude about things as you can. And what that does is, rather than getting into the negative dialogue, because one of the things I found at one point I was involved with the Wesley Clark campaign. And one of the things I found was that the kind of negative bashing of George Bush, it's kind of like, or was equal to the kind of things that I had heard from the Republican side. It's kind of like everybody's involved in this. I mean, it's like some of you might have an opportunity at some point. You listen to Air America and you listen to the afternoon, some of the Air America shows. I identify with a lot of the views they take, but some of the attitude or the emotion that they convey in the message is just as negative as listening to Rush. It's no different. Okay? And to some extent, so long as the dialogue is kept at that emotional level, then what's going to happen is when John Kerry wins the election, what's going to happen is that if people are lapse into that kind of frenetic, celebratory type of way of doing things, saying, yeah, we kicked butt, what's going to happen is the same negative attitudes and negative ways of handling things are going to be a part of the dialogue, and it's going to create another polarity, another polar response to that, which is going to then come back and haunt just as much. Okay, what's got a front's got a back. The bigger the front, the bigger the back. The more you the more you hold out. It's kind of like saying, it's like when people say, I'm never going to be like my mother or my father. You're adamantly against it, and then you find out that, lo and behold, because of your vehement attachment to that way of being, and you trying to push yourself against it, what ends up happening is you find yourself backed into a corner where you become that. Okay? So, for me, what I look at in this particular time period is that we have to learn how to stay mindful, focused, peaceful, yet active. Okay, the reason why, when I wrote the title, The Buddha at War, what I was talking about is the Buddha is always at war with three things, and I mentioned this in the last last talk that I gave here. Those three things which actually fuel the polarity are ignorance, attachment, and aggression. Simply put, we don't understand the full picture of what's going on. We get attached to our particular view of what we think is going on, and we get annoyed with everybody who disagrees with us. Okay? And therefore, what the Buddha, historical Buddha, and all the Buddhas that have existed in the past have seen is, so long as we are caught in those three things, so long as we respond or react to the world based on those poisons, what's going to happen is we're going to keep on seeing the perpetuation of suffering.